Long before pyramids rose from the desert sand, before pharaohs claimed divine authority over gods and mortals alike, there was simply the river, the Nile, flowing steadily northward through an otherwise unforgiving landscape of endless sand and stone. Each year, without fail, the Nile would flood its banks, depositing rich, dark silt across the surrounding land, creating a narrow ribbon of extraordinarily fertile soil, surrounded on both sides by harsh, uninhabitable desert. Early communities gradually recognized this flood cycle's remarkable, life-giving predictability. By around 5000 BCE, small farming settlements had begun forming along the Nile's banks, communities learning to work in careful rhythm with the river's annual flooding, planting crops in the nutrient-rich mud left behind as floodwaters receded each year. These early Egyptian communities developed increasingly sophisticated irrigation techniques, digging canals and basins that helped control and distribute the Nile's floodwaters more effectively across larger areas of farmland, allowing populations to grow steadily larger and more permanently settled. Two distinct regions gradually emerged along the river: Upper Egypt to the south, where the Nile flowed through a narrower valley, and Lower Egypt to the north, where the river spread into a wide, fertile delta before finally reaching the Mediterranean Sea. For centuries, these two regions developed somewhat separately, each forming its own local traditions, leadership structures, and religious practices, though both remained fundamentally shaped by their shared dependence upon the Nile's life-giving, predictable cycles. Around 3100 BCE, according to traditional Egyptian accounts, a ruler named Narmer, sometimes identified with a legendary figure called Menes, successfully unified Upper and Lower Egypt under a single centralized authority, an event later Egyptians would remember as one of their civilization's foundational moments. This unification created what historians now call the first unified Egyptian state, one of the world's earliest large-scale centralized governments, with a single ruler, eventually called Pharaoh, claiming authority over the entire narrow, fertile strip of land stretching along the Nile's course. Early Egyptian rulers quickly began developing systems for organizing labor, collecting resources, and coordinating large-scale projects across this unified territory, laying essential administrative groundwork that would eventually enable the construction of monuments on a scale unprecedented in the ancient world. Writing developed during this early period as well, Egyptian scribes creating hieroglyphic symbols initially for practical purposes like tracking harvests, resources, and administrative records, though this writing system would eventually expand to encompass religious texts, historical records, and literature. Religious belief, too, took increasingly organized shape during these foundational centuries, Egyptians developing an elaborate pantheon of gods closely associated with natural forces and cycles, particularly the sun, the Nile's flooding, and the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth that so thoroughly shaped Egyptian spiritual understanding. By the time this early unified state had firmly established itself, Egypt possessed nearly all the essential foundations: centralized authority, organized labor, written language, and elaborate religious tradition that would soon enable the remarkable civilization the ancient world, and countless generations following it, would come to recognize as one of humanity's most enduring and fascinating achievements. With Egypt firmly unified under centralized pharaonic rule, the period historians now call the Old Kingdom began around 2686 BCE, an era that would eventually produce some of humanity's most enduring and recognizable monuments. Early Old Kingdom pharaohs experimented with increasingly ambitious tomb designs, moving gradually from simple mastaba structures, flat-roofed rectangular buildings, toward more elaborate, stepped, and eventually smooth-sided pyramid forms that would come to define this remarkable architectural period. Pharaoh Djoser's architect Imhotep designed what many consider Egypt's first true pyramid around 2650 BCE, a stepped structure at Saqqara that represented a revolutionary leap in both scale and architectural ambition compared to earlier, simpler royal tombs. This stepped pyramid design evolved rapidly over subsequent decades, culminating eventually in the smooth-sided pyramid form most people today immediately associate with ancient Egypt, structures requiring extraordinary mathematical precision, engineering knowledge, and organized labor to construct successfully. The most famous of these monuments, the Great Pyramid of Giza, was built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, originally standing approximately 146 meters tall, remaining the world's tallest human-made structure for well over 3,000 years following its completion. Constructing such a massive monument required coordinating tens of thousands of workers. Contrary to popular myth, these were not enslaved foreign captives, but rather organized teams of skilled Egyptian laborers, often working in rotating shifts during the Nile's flood season when farming activities naturally paused. These workers required housing, food, and medical care. Archaeological evidence revealing organized worker communities near the pyramid construction sites, complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities, supporting this massive, coordinated national project. The pyramids served as elaborate tombs designed to protect and support the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Egyptian religious belief holding that proper burial preparation, including preserved bodies and abundant grave goods, was essential for successful transition into eternal life beyond death. Surrounding each major pyramid, smaller pyramids and elaborate temple complexes housed queens, royal family members, and provided spaces for ongoing religious rituals meant to sustain the deceased pharaoh's spirit throughout eternity. The Great Sphinx, a massive limestone statue combining a lion's body with a human head, likely representing Pharaoh Khafre, was carved during this same general period, standing guard near the Giza Pyramid complex as one of the ancient world's most recognizable and enigmatic monuments. This pyramid-building tradition eventually declined toward the Old Kingdom's later centuries, subsequent pharaohs constructing smaller, less ambitious monuments as centralized authority gradually weakened and regional governors accumulated increasing independent power and wealth. By around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom's centralized authority had weakened considerably, drought, economic strain, and growing regional independence contributing to a period of political fragmentation historians call the First Intermediate Period, temporarily interrupting Egypt's remarkable early unified achievement. Following decades of political fragmentation and regional conflict, Egypt gradually began reunifying under Theban rulers around 2055 BCE, ushering in a period historians call the Middle Kingdom, often considered ancient Egypt's classical age of literature and cultural achievement. Pharaoh Mentuhotep II successfully reunified Egypt's fractured territories, re-establishing centralized authority and beginning a period of renewed stability, infrastructure development, and cultural flourishing that would continue for several subsequent centuries. Middle Kingdom pharaohs focused considerable attention on expanding Egypt's agricultural capacity, particularly through ambitious irrigation projects in the Fayum region, converting previously marginal land into productive farmland that helped support continued population growth. This period also saw significant military expansion southward into Nubia, Egyptian forces establishing fortified positions along the Nile's upper reaches, securing access to valuable resources including gold, ivory, and other goods traded through this strategically important southern frontier. Middle Kingdom literature flourished remarkably during this period, scribes producing sophisticated poetry, philosophical texts, and narrative stories that later Egyptian generations would continue studying and copying for over 1,000 years, establishing literary traditions considered classics throughout subsequent Egyptian history. The Tale of Sinuhe, composed during this period, exemplifies this literary flourishing, a sophisticated narrative following a court official's dramatic exile and eventual return, demonstrating increasingly complex storytelling techniques and psychological depth in Egyptian literary tradition. Religious practice also evolved significantly during the Middle Kingdom. The god Osiris, associated with death, resurrection, and the afterlife, growing increasingly central to Egyptian religious belief, his mythology offering ordinary Egyptians, not merely pharaohs, hope for meaningful afterlife existence. Artistic style during this period showed subtle but meaningful evolution as well. Sculptors and painters developing increasingly naturalistic, sometimes strikingly individualized royal portraits that captured signs of age, worry, and human vulnerability rather than purely idealized divine perfection. Trade expanded considerably during the Middle Kingdom. Egyptian merchants and diplomatic missions maintaining active relationships with neighboring regions, including the Levant, Nubia, and various Mediterranean trading partners, bringing valuable resources and goods into Egyptian markets. Toward the Middle Kingdom's later centuries, gradual political weakening once again began affecting centralized Egyptian authority, compounded eventually by the arrival of foreign settlers called the Hyksos, who would eventually establish independent rule over portions of northern Egypt. By around 1650 BCE, this growing instability had fragmented Egypt once again, ushering in the Second Intermediate Period, a challenging era during which foreign Hyksos rulers controlled significant Egyptian territory, setting the stage for a dramatic Egyptian resurgence still to come. Egyptian resistance against Hyksos foreign rule gradually gathered momentum from Thebes in the south, Theban rulers organizing increasingly effective military campaigns that would eventually expel foreign control entirely and reunify Egypt under native authority once again. Pharaoh Ahmose successfully completed this reunification around 1550 BCE, decisively defeating remaining Hyksos forces and beginning what historians call the New Kingdom, widely considered ancient Egypt's most powerful, wealthy, and militarily dominant historical period. New Kingdom pharaohs, having experienced the vulnerability of foreign invasion firsthand, pursued increasingly aggressive military expansion, Egyptian armies pushing deep into the Levant and further south into Nubia, transforming Egypt from a primarily defensive regional power into a genuine ancient empire. Pharaoh Thutmose III proved particularly militarily successful, leading numerous campaigns that expanded Egyptian territorial control and influence further than any previous pharaoh had achieved, earning him later historical recognition as something like ancient Egypt's own remarkable military strategist. This imperial expansion brought enormous wealth flowing into Egypt through tribute, trade, and captured resources, funding increasingly ambitious temple construction projects and royal monuments throughout Egyptian territory, particularly concentrated around the religious capital of Thebes. Religious transformation also marked this remarkable period, most dramatically when Pharaoh Akhenaten attempted a radical religious revolution around 1353 BCE, promoting worship of a single sun deity called the Aten, while actively suppressing Egypt's traditional, elaborate polytheistic religious practices. Akhenaten relocated Egypt's capital entirely to a newly constructed city called Amarna, built specifically to honor this new religious focus, though this dramatic religious experiment proved deeply unpopular and was largely reversed following his death, Egyptian religious tradition quickly returning to its familiar polytheistic practices. Akhenaten's successor, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, though relatively unremarkable during his own brief historical reign, would eventually become ancient Egypt's most famous pharaoh among modern audiences, his intact tomb's spectacular 1922 discovery revealing treasures that captivated worldwide attention. Ramesses II, ruling for an extraordinarily long 66 years beginning around 1279 BCE, became perhaps the New Kingdom's most prolific builder, constructing numerous massive temples and monuments throughout Egypt, while also engaging in significant military campaigns against the rival Hittite Empire. This conflict eventually produced one of history's earliest recorded peace treaties, Egypt and the Hittites, formally establishing diplomatic terms following the inconclusive Battle of Kadesh, demonstrating increasingly sophisticated ancient diplomatic practices beyond purely military conquest. By the New Kingdom's later centuries, Egypt's imperial power gradually began facing increasing challenges, including invasions from mysterious groups historians call the Sea Peoples, internal political tensions, and gradually weakening centralized authority that would eventually bring this remarkable imperial age toward its own complicated, gradual conclusion. Following the New Kingdom's gradual decline, Egypt entered a lengthy period historians call the Third Intermediate Period, beginning around 1069 BCE, characterized by fragmented political authority, competing regional rulers, and periods where different dynasties claimed pharaonic authority, simultaneously, across different Egyptian territories. This political fragmentation created opportunities for foreign powers to exert increasing influence over Egyptian affairs. Nubian rulers from the south, eventually establishing their own pharaonic dynasty around 747 BCE, ruling Egypt for several decades before facing their own eventual challenges. Assyrian forces invaded Egypt during the 670s and 660s BCE, briefly establishing control before Egyptian resistance, led eventually by Pharaoh Psamtik I, successfully restored native Egyptian rule, beginning what historians call the Late Period, around 664 BCE. This late period saw renewed cultural confidence, Egyptian rulers deliberately looking backward toward Old and Middle Kingdom artistic and religious traditions, a conscious cultural revival meant to reassert authentic Egyptian identity following decades of foreign influence and political instability. Trade and diplomatic relationships expanded considerably during this period, Egyptian rulers maintaining careful, pragmatic relationships with increasingly powerful neighboring civilizations, including growing Greek commercial and cultural influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean region. Despite these efforts toward stability, Egypt faced renewed foreign pressure from the expanding Persian Empire, Persian forces successfully conquering Egypt in 525 BCE under Cambyses II, incorporating Egyptian territory as a wealthy, strategically important Persian imperial province. Persian rule proved administratively significant but culturally complicated, Persian authorities generally allowing continued Egyptian religious practice and local administrative traditions, while extracting substantial resources and tribute to support broader Persian imperial ambitions across their vast territorial holdings. Egyptian resistance against Persian rule flared periodically throughout this period, achieving temporary independence on several occasions before Persian forces successfully reasserted control. This pattern of resistance and reconquest characterizing much of Egypt's complicated relationship with Persian imperial authority. This turbulent period of foreign domination and periodic native resistance would eventually set the stage for an entirely new chapter in Egyptian history, one initiated by a young Macedonian conqueror whose arrival would permanently reshape Egypt's political and cultural trajectory. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great's forces entered Egypt, Persian authorities offering little effective resistance against this remarkably successful young Macedonian conqueror who had already dramatically defeated Persian forces elsewhere throughout the region. Egyptians largely welcomed Alexander as a liberator from unpopular Persian rule, Egyptian priests formally recognizing him as pharaoh, incorporating him into traditional Egyptian religious and political frameworks despite his foreign Macedonian origins. Alexander founded the city of Alexandria along Egypt's Mediterranean coast, a strategically positioned port city that would eventually grow into one of the ancient world's most significant centers of trade, scholarship, and cultural exchange between Egyptian, Greek, and broader Mediterranean civilizations. Following Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his vast empire fragmented among competing generals, one of whom, Ptolemy, successfully claimed Egypt as his own independent territory, founding what historians call the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek-descended rulers who would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic rulers maintained a complicated dual identity, presenting themselves as traditional Egyptian pharaohs for religious and administrative purposes, while simultaneously maintaining Greek cultural traditions, language, and customs within their royal court and broader administrative structures. Alexandria flourished remarkably under Ptolemaic patronage, becoming home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, an ambitious project attempting to collect and preserve written knowledge from across the ancient world, drawing scholars from throughout the Mediterranean region. This scholarly environment produced significant achievements across multiple fields: mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians working within Alexandria's intellectual community, making advances that would influence scientific and philosophical thought for centuries following the Ptolemaic period itself. Religious practice under Ptolemaic rule blended Egyptian and Greek traditions in genuinely innovative ways. The god Serapis, emerging as a deliberately syncretic deity, combining Egyptian and Greek religious characteristics, reflecting broader cultural blending occurring throughout Ptolemaic Egyptian society. Despite this cultural flourishing, Ptolemaic political stability gradually weakened over subsequent generations, family succession disputes, economic strain, and growing Roman influence throughout the Mediterranean, increasingly threatening Egypt's continued independence as the centuries progressed. By the final decades of Ptolemaic rule, Egypt found itself increasingly entangled in complicated political relationships with an ascendant Roman Republic, whose growing Mediterranean dominance made Egyptian independence increasingly precarious, despite the kingdom's continued substantial wealth. Cleopatra VII, ascending to Egyptian rule in 51 BCE, proved remarkably capable at navigating these treacherous political circumstances, forming significant personal and political alliances with prominent Roman leaders, including Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages, reportedly including Egyptian itself, unlike most previous Ptolemaic rulers who had maintained Greek as their primary language, suggesting her genuine engagement with authentic Egyptian culture and religious tradition beyond mere political convenience. Her relationship with Julius Caesar produced a son, while her subsequent, more extensively documented relationship with Mark Antony created a powerful political alliance that briefly seemed capable of successfully resisting growing Roman imperial ambition under Octavian, Caesar's eventual successor. This alliance ultimately proved unsuccessful, Octavian's forces decisively defeating Antony and Cleopatra's combined military forces at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, effectively ending any remaining hope for continued Egyptian political independence from Roman authority. Following this defeat, both Antony and Cleopatra died in Alexandria in 30 BCE, their deaths marking the definitive end of Ptolemaic rule and, more broadly, the conclusion of over 3,000 years of continuous Egyptian pharaonic tradition, stretching back to Narmer's original unification. Egypt subsequently became a Roman province, administered directly under imperial Roman authority, its immense agricultural wealth, particularly grain production, becoming crucially important for feeding Rome's rapidly growing urban population throughout the following centuries of imperial rule. Egyptian religious and cultural traditions persisted for generations under Roman administration, though gradually blending increasingly with Roman and later Christian influences. Ancient Egyptian religious practice eventually declining substantially as Christianity spread throughout Egyptian territory during subsequent centuries. The hieroglyphic writing system itself, once so central to Egyptian civilization's administrative and religious life, gradually fell out of active use following the ancient Egyptian religious tradition's decline, its meaning eventually becoming entirely lost until scholars finally deciphered it again many centuries later. This final chapter, Cleopatra's dramatic story and Egypt's subsequent absorption into the Roman world, represents both a genuine historical ending and, in the popular imagination, one of ancient history's most enduring, romantically remembered conclusions to an extraordinary, millennia-spanning civilization. For over 1,000 years following ancient Egyptian religious traditions' decline, hieroglyphic writing remained an entirely mysterious visual language, its intricate symbols admired for their beauty, but completely unreadable to scholars who had lost all understanding of how this sophisticated writing system actually functioned. This changed dramatically in 1799, when French soldiers, part of Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian military campaign, discovered a large granite slab near the town of Rosetta, its surface covered with the same text carved in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, a simplified Egyptian script called Demotic, and ancient Greek. Scholars immediately recognized this discovery's extraordinary potential significance, reasoning that since ancient Greek remained perfectly readable, careful comparison between all 3 scripts might finally unlock hieroglyphic writing's long-lost meaning after so many centuries of complete mystery. Progress proved slower and more complicated than initial optimism suggested, various scholars across Europe spending years attempting different decoding approaches, most incorrectly assuming hieroglyphs functioned as purely symbolic pictures rather than representing actual spoken language sounds. A French scholar named Jean-François Champollion eventually made the crucial breakthrough in 1822, correctly recognizing that hieroglyphic symbols actually represented specific sounds, similar to how modern alphabets function, combined with certain symbols representing complete concepts or objects directly. Champollion's careful analysis, comparing royal names appearing in both hieroglyphic and Greek text on the Rosetta Stone, allowed him to systematically decode the writing system's underlying rules, finally unlocking 3,000 years of previously unreadable ancient Egyptian texts. This remarkable decipherment opened an entirely new field of scholarly study, Egyptology, allowing historians finally direct access to Egyptian texts, describing religious beliefs, historical events, administrative records, and everyday life details, previously accessible only through limited, often unreliable second-hand accounts from ancient Greek and Roman writers. Subsequent archaeological excavations throughout Egypt, continuing steadily through the following 2 centuries, combined with this crucial linguistic breakthrough, gradually revealed an increasingly detailed, nuanced understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization across its entire 3,000-year historical span. The Rosetta Stone itself became one of history's most celebrated archaeological artifacts, eventually housed in the British Museum, standing as a powerful symbol of how patient scholarly persistence can eventually unlock even civilization's most seemingly impenetrable historical mysteries. Ancient Egyptian religious belief developed an extraordinarily rich, complex pantheon of deities, each associated with specific natural forces, human experiences, or cosmic principles that together formed a comprehensive framework for understanding existence itself. Ra, the sun god, held particular significance throughout much of Egyptian history, believed to travel across the sky each day in a divine boat before journeying through the dangerous underworld each night. His successful daily rebirth, ensuring the sun's continued reliable return each morning. Osiris held equally central importance, particularly regarding death and the afterlife, Egyptian mythology describing how he was murdered by his brother Set before being resurrected through his wife Isis's devoted efforts, becoming ruler of the underworld and offering hope for similar resurrection to deceased mortals. Isis herself became one of ancient Egypt's most beloved and widely worshipped deities, associated with magic, motherhood, and devoted loyalty, her mythology eventually spreading well beyond Egypt itself, gaining dedicated worshippers throughout the broader Greco-Roman Mediterranean world. Horus, son of Isis and Osiris, represented rightful kingship and divine order. Egyptian pharaohs, traditionally considered Horus's living embodiment during their earthly reign, this divine association helping legitimize and reinforce pharaonic political and religious authority throughout Egyptian history. Anubis, depicted with a jackal's head, oversaw mummification and guided souls through the dangerous underworld journey, his presence in tomb paintings and funerary texts reflecting his crucial protective role during this perilous, uncertain passage toward eternal afterlife existence. Egyptian cosmology understood existence as maintained through a delicate principle called Ma'at, representing truth, balance, and cosmic order, pharaohs bearing particular responsibility for maintaining this crucial balance through proper religious observance and just governance throughout their earthly reign. This religious framework provided remarkably comprehensive explanations for natural phenomena, human mortality, and moral behavior. Egyptian religious texts describing how deceased individuals would eventually face judgment, their heart weighed against Ma'at's feather, to determine their worthiness for successful afterlife existence. Temple complexes throughout Egypt served as these deities' earthly dwelling places. Elaborate daily rituals performed by dedicated priests, believed necessary for maintaining proper relationship between mortal worshippers and the powerful divine forces governing their world's continued stability and prosperity. This intricate religious system evolved gradually across Egypt's long history, different deities gaining or losing prominence during different periods, yet maintaining remarkable overall continuity and coherence across 3,000 years, representing one of history's most enduring, sophisticated religious traditions. Central to Egyptian religious belief was the conviction that proper preservation of the physical body was essential for successful passage into eternal afterlife existence, leading to mummification's development as an increasingly sophisticated, ritually significant funerary practice. Early mummification attempts, developed gradually over centuries, eventually produced remarkably effective preservation techniques capable of maintaining recognizable human remains for thousands of years. Techniques modern scientists still study with considerable admiration for their technical sophistication. The mummification process typically began with careful removal of internal organs, believed likely to cause decomposition, the brain removed through careful nasal extraction, while other major organs were preserved separately in specialized containers called canopic jars, each protected by a specific guardian deity. The heart, uniquely, was deliberately left within the body, Egyptian belief holding that this organ represented the seat of intelligence and emotion, essential for the crucial afterlife judgment where it would be weighed against Ma'at's feather to determine the deceased's ultimate spiritual fate. Following organ removal, the body underwent an extensive drying process using natron, a naturally occurring salt compound. The body typically left covered in this drying substance for approximately 40 days, gradually removing moisture that would otherwise cause decomposition. Once thoroughly dried, embalmers carefully wrapped the body in numerous layers of linen bandages, often inserting protective amulets between individual wrapping layers, each amulet believed to provide specific magical protection during the deceased's dangerous underworld journey. Wealthy Egyptians could afford increasingly elaborate mummification procedures and burial preparations, including beautifully decorated coffins, extensive grave goods, and elaborate tomb decoration, while less wealthy individuals received simpler, though still ritually significant, preservation treatment. Funerary texts, including what modern scholars call the Book of the Dead, provided deceased individuals with detailed guidance and protective spells intended to help navigate the underworld's numerous dangers successfully, reaching final judgment and, hopefully, eternal peaceful afterlife existence. This elaborate mummification tradition continued for thousands of years throughout Egyptian history, gradually declining only as Christianity spread throughout Egyptian territory during the Roman period, this new religious tradition offering different understanding of death, resurrection, and eternal life. Modern archaeological and scientific study of preserved Egyptian mummies continues providing remarkable insight into ancient Egyptian daily life, health conditions, and religious practice. These carefully preserved remains, offering an extraordinarily direct, tangible connection to individuals who lived and died thousands of years ago. Beyond the pharaohs, temples, and monumental architecture that dominate popular imagination, ancient Egyptian civilization consisted primarily of ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and laborers whose daily lives, though less dramatically documented, formed the essential foundation supporting Egypt's remarkable civilization. Most Egyptians worked as farmers, their lives organized around the Nile's predictable annual flooding cycle, planting crops including wheat, barley, and flax during the fertile post-flood season. This agricultural rhythm shaping virtually every aspect of ordinary Egyptian social and economic life. Egyptian houses, particularly for ordinary families, were typically constructed from mud brick, a readily available, practical building material well-suited to Egypt's hot, dry climate. Homes, usually featuring flat roofs, that families used for additional living space during cooler evening hours. Family structures centered around household units, women holding notably significant legal rights compared to many other ancient civilizations, able to own property, initiate divorce proceedings, and conduct independent business transactions, reflecting a relatively progressive social structure for their historical era. Children typically began learning practical skills from their parents at young ages, boys often following their father's occupation, whether farming, craftsmanship, or other trades, while formal scribal education, teaching valuable hieroglyphic literacy, remained available primarily to wealthier families who could afford dedicated schooling. Food staples included bread and beer, both produced from grain, forming dietary foundations across all social classes, while wealthier households enjoyed greater variety, including meat, fish, and imported delicacies that remained luxuries beyond ordinary farmers' typical daily means. Egyptian craftsmen developed remarkable skill across numerous specialized trades, including pottery, woodworking, metalworking, and jewelry making, artisan communities often clustering together in dedicated workshop districts within larger Egyptian towns and cities. Markets provided essential venues for exchanging goods, Egyptian economy functioning primarily through barter systems rather than standardized currency. For much of ancient Egyptian history, standardized weights and measures helping ensure fair, consistent trading practices throughout different regions. Leisure activities included board games, particularly one called sonnet, music, dancing, and storytelling, archaeological evidence revealing that ordinary Egyptians, much like people throughout history, valued entertainment and social connection alongside their practical daily labor and responsibilities. This rich, detailed picture of ordinary Egyptian daily life, reconstructed carefully through archaeological evidence and decoded textual records, reveals a genuinely human civilization, one whose ordinary citizens navigated work, family, and community life in ways both distinctly ancient and, in certain fundamental respects, remarkably relatable even today. Egyptian art maintained remarkably consistent stylistic conventions across thousands of years. Artists following established formal principles that prioritized clarity, symbolic meaning, and religious function over the more naturalistic artistic approaches later civilizations would eventually develop. Human figures in Egyptian painting and relief carving typically followed a distinctive convention, combining frontal and profile perspectives within a single figure. Head and legs shown in profile, while torso and eyes appeared frontally, a stylized approach meant to represent subjects as completely and recognizably as possible. This consistent artistic style served important religious and functional purposes beyond mere aesthetic preference. Tomb paintings and temple reliefs meant to magically provide deceased individuals with everything depicted, food, servants, and daily activities, throughout their eternal afterlife existence. Egyptian architecture achieved extraordinary engineering sophistication, particularly evident in massive temple complexes like Karnak near Thebes, featuring enormous stone columns, elaborate hieroglyphic decoration, and carefully calculated astronomical alignments connecting architectural design with religious and cosmic significance. Temple construction typically followed consistent architectural principles. Entrance pylons leading through increasingly sacred, restricted spaces toward an innermost sanctuary housing the temple's primary deity statue. Only the highest-ranking priests permitted access to these most sacred inner chambers. Obelisks, tall, four-sided stone monuments tapering toward pyramidal tops, served as significant architectural and religious symbols throughout Egyptian history, often erected in pairs flanking temple entrances, their surfaces frequently covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions celebrating pharaonic achievements and religious dedications. Egyptian sculptors worked skillfully across various materials, including limestone, granite, and precious metals. Royal statuary, typically emphasizing idealized, eternally youthful pharaonic appearance, meant to represent divine kingship rather than accurate individual physical likeness. Jewelry and decorative arts reached remarkable sophistication as well, Egyptian craftsmen combining gold, precious stones, and colored glass into elaborate pieces, serving both decorative and protective religious functions, many pieces specifically designed for inclusion among elaborate burial goods. Colossal statuary, including massive seated pharaonic figures like those guarding Ramesses II's temple at Abu Simbel, demonstrated Egyptian engineering capability for transporting and precisely positioning enormous stone blocks, achievements that continue impressing modern engineers studying ancient construction techniques. This remarkable artistic and architectural tradition, maintained with impressive consistency across 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, left behind some of humanity's most recognizable and enduring monuments, structures that continue drawing millions of visitors seeking direct connection with this extraordinary ancient achievement. Beyond religious and artistic achievement, ancient Egyptian civilization developed remarkably sophisticated practical knowledge across mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, knowledge systems that supported everything from monumental construction projects to agricultural planning and religious calendar calculation. Egyptian mathematics developed primarily around practical applications, scribes developing effective systems for calculating land area following the Nile's annual flooding, essential for fair taxation and agricultural planning across Egypt's complex, centrally administered agricultural economy. Egyptian architects and engineers applied sophisticated geometric and mathematical understanding toward monumental construction projects, pyramid builders achieving remarkable precision in alignment and proportion, using relatively simple tools and calculation methods that modern engineers continue studying with genuine admiration. Astronomical observation held particular importance for Egyptian religious and practical purposes, priests carefully tracking celestial movements, particularly the star Sirius's annual reappearance, which reliably predicted the Nile's coming flood. This astronomical knowledge directly supporting essential agricultural planning. This astronomical observation eventually contributed to Egypt's development of an increasingly accurate calendar system, dividing the year into 12 months, each containing 30 days, plus 5 additional days, creating a 365-day calendar remarkably close to the actual solar year's true length. Egyptian medicine achieved impressive sophistication as well, medical papyri revealing detailed anatomical knowledge, surgical techniques, and treatment approaches for various injuries and ailments, some treatments involving genuinely effective herbal remedies still recognized for their medicinal properties today. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text describing surgical trauma treatment, demonstrates remarkably systematic, almost scientific diagnostic approaches, physicians carefully documenting symptoms, prognosis, and treatment recommendations in ways that impressed modern medical historians studying this ancient text. Egyptian physicians specialized across different medical fields, some focusing specifically on particular ailments or body regions, reflecting a surprisingly sophisticated, organized approach to medical practice that included both practical treatment and, alongside it, religious and magical healing elements reflecting broader Egyptian worldview. Engineering achievements extended beyond monumental architecture into practical infrastructure as well. Egyptian engineers, developing effective irrigation systems, transportation networks, and construction techniques that supported their civilization's remarkable agricultural productivity and monumental building capacity across thousands of years. This substantial body of practical scientific and medical knowledge, though developed within a worldview that seamlessly blended empirical observation with religious and magical belief, represents a genuinely impressive intellectual achievement, one that supported Egyptian civilization's remarkable stability and productivity across an extraordinarily long historical span. While ancient Egyptian pharaonic authority was predominantly male, several remarkable women achieved significant power and lasting historical recognition, their stories offering fascinating insight into Egyptian society's occasionally flexible approach toward gender and legitimate rule. Hatshepsut, ruling as pharaoh from approximately 1479 to 1458 BCE, represents perhaps ancient Egypt's most successful female ruler, initially serving as regent for her young stepson before eventually claiming full pharaonic authority and title in her own right. Hatshepsut skillfully legitimized her unusual position through careful religious and artistic messaging, some official statuary depicting her with traditional pharaonic symbols including the ceremonial false beard, asserting her authority through established royal iconography despite her female identity. Her reign proved remarkably successful and stable, Hatshepsut focusing considerable attention on trade expansion, particularly a celebrated expedition to the distant land of Punt, bringing back valuable goods including incense, exotic animals, and other luxury items that enhanced Egyptian prestige and wealth. She also commissioned extensive architecturally innovative building projects, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari standing as one of ancient Egypt's most architecturally distinctive monuments, its terrace design differing notably from more traditional Egyptian temple architecture. Following Hatshepsut's death, later Egyptian records show some attempts to remove her from official historical memory, her monuments and inscriptions sometimes deliberately damaged, though modern archaeology has successfully restored her rightful historical recognition as one of ancient Egypt's most capable rulers. Nefertiti, wife of the religiously revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten, represents another remarkably prominent Egyptian royal woman, her famous painted bust, discovered in 1912, becoming one of the ancient world's most recognizable and admired artistic achievements. Nefertiti appears to have held unusually significant political and religious influence during her husband's reign, some depictions showing her performing religious rituals typically reserved exclusively for pharaohs themselves, suggesting she wielded considerably more authority than most Egyptian royal consorts. Some historians speculate Nefertiti may have briefly ruled independently following Akhenaten's death, though definitive historical evidence remains genuinely uncertain. her later life and exact historical fate continuing to generate scholarly debate and fascination even among modern Egyptological researchers. These remarkable women, alongside several other notable Egyptian queens and female officials throughout the civilization's long history, demonstrate that while pharaonic authority remained predominantly male, ancient Egyptian society possessed genuine flexibility for exceptional women to achieve significant power, recognition, and lasting historical legacy. Throughout its long history, ancient Egyptian civilization maintained complex, evolving relationships with numerous neighboring civilizations, alternating between military conflict, diplomatic negotiation, and extensive trade that connected Egypt with the broader ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean world. Egyptian military organization evolved considerably across different historical periods, early armies relying primarily on infantry equipped with bronze weapons, while later, New Kingdom forces incorporated increasingly sophisticated chariot warfare, adopted partly through contact with foreign civilizations, including the Hyksos. Nubia, Egypt's southern neighbor, maintained a particularly complex relationship with Egyptian civilization across thousands of years, alternating between Egyptian military control, independent Nubian kingdoms, and even periods where Nubian rulers themselves claimed Egyptian pharaonic authority. The Levant region, encompassing much of the modern Middle East, similarly experienced fluctuating Egyptian influence, New Kingdom pharaohs particularly extending significant military and administrative control throughout this strategically important region, connecting Egypt with broader Near Eastern trade networks and rival civilizations. The Hittite Empire emerged as ancient Egypt's most significant rival power during much of the New Kingdom period, this rivalry culminating in the famous Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, an inconclusive but historically significant military confrontation between these two major ancient powers. Following this costly conflict, Egypt and the Hittites eventually negotiated a formal peace treaty, one of history's earliest surviving diplomatic agreements, establishing mutual defense obligations and marking a notable shift toward diplomatic resolution over continued costly military confrontation. Egyptian diplomatic correspondence, particularly documents known as the Amarna letters, reveals sophisticated ancient diplomatic practices. Egyptian pharaohs maintaining active written communication with numerous foreign rulers throughout the ancient Near East, negotiating alliances, marriages, and trade relationships. Trade relationships extended Egyptian influence far beyond military conquest alone. Egyptian goods, particularly gold, grain, and manufactured luxury items, reaching distant markets throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, while Egypt itself imported valuable resources, including cedar wood, precious metals, and exotic goods unavailable within Egyptian territory. By Egypt's later historical periods, declining military strength relative to emerging rival powers, including Assyria, Persia, and eventually Rome, gradually diminished Egyptian independent political and military influence, though Egyptian cultural and religious prestige continued commanding considerable respect throughout the ancient world. This long, complicated history of military conflict, diplomatic negotiation, and extensive trade demonstrates that ancient Egypt, despite its distinctive, relatively isolated geographic position along the Nile, remained deeply, continuously connected with the broader ancient world throughout its entire 3,000-year historical span. As our long journey through ancient Egyptian history draws toward its close, it's worth pausing to consider just how remarkably this civilization's achievements continue shaping human understanding and imagination, even thousands of years after the last pharaoh's reign concluded. The pyramids themselves remain among humanity's most recognizable monuments, their precise construction continuing to impress modern engineers and inspire genuine wonder among the millions of visitors who travel each year specifically to witness these extraordinary ancient achievements firsthand. Egyptian religious concepts, particularly regarding death, judgment, and afterlife existence, influenced numerous subsequent religious traditions throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Ideas about moral judgment following death echoing forward into later religious and philosophical thought across many subsequent civilizations. The systematic mummification techniques Egyptian embalmers developed continue providing modern scientists with extraordinary insight into ancient human health, disease, and daily life. Preserved remains offering direct physical evidence that written records alone could never fully provide. Egyptian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, while eventually surpassed by later civilizations, represented genuinely impressive early scientific achievement, establishing practical calculation methods and calendar systems that influenced subsequent ancient Mediterranean scientific and administrative practice. The eventual decipherment of hieroglyphic writing through the Rosetta Stone demonstrated something profound about human historical curiosity itself, our persistent desire to understand and connect with civilizations long past, however distant or seemingly mysterious their surviving remnants might initially appear. Modern popular culture continues drawing heavily upon ancient Egyptian imagery and mythology, from museum exhibitions drawing enormous crowds to countless films, books, and artistic works inspired by pharaohs, pyramids, and the broader mystique surrounding this remarkable ancient civilization. Egyptology as an academic field continues actively developing today. New archaeological discoveries and advancing scientific techniques regularly revealing fresh insight into ancient Egyptian civilization, our understanding continuing to deepen and evolve even after 2 centuries of dedicated scholarly study. Perhaps most remarkably, ancient Egyptian civilization's own historical self-awareness, their careful preservation of records, monuments, and religious tradition across thousands of years, reflects a civilization deeply conscious of its own historical continuity, one that deliberately sought to endure and be remembered by future generations. In this sense, ancient Egypt succeeded remarkably in its own fundamental aspiration, achieving a form of enduring legacy and remembrance that few other ancient civilizations have managed to sustain so vividly, so many thousands of years after pharaonic Egypt's own historical conclusion. And so, as this long journey through Nile Valley history finally settles toward its quiet close, let these ancient stones, preserved mummies, and patient centuries of careful human achievement carry you now gently toward whatever peaceful rest awaits. Ancient Egypt's remarkable, enduring story, finally, softly, fading into restful silence.